In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing, so you won't miss the secrets buried deep within the land. Now prepare yourselves for a story of desperation, innovation, and vengeance. The dust tasted like failure. Arthur knew the flavor intimately, a constant sacrament of his ruin. It was the gritty film on his teeth when he woke in the pre-dawn gloom, a phantom of the fields that were turning to powder. It was the bitter silt at the bottom of his coffee cup, a daily reminder of a legacy dissolving into insolvency. For 3 generations, the Miller farm had tasted of rich, dark earth, of promises kept. It tasted of sweet corn in the suffocating heat of August, and the sharp, clean bite of apples in the crisp air of October. It was the taste of his grandfather's sweat and his father's hope. Now, under the tyranny of a relentless, brassy sun and the vast indifference of an empty sky, it tasted only of ash. The foreclosure notice sat on the kitchen table, a crisp, white ghost haunting the heart of his home. It mocked the peeling paint on the walls and the linoleum worn through to the subfloor by the footfalls of ghosts he could no longer appease. 7 days. The words were a death sentence, clinical and precise. 7 days until a century of calloused hands, broken backs, and unwavering faith was reduced to a line item on an auction block. 7 days until Sterling Harris, a man whose polished Italian leather shoes had never known the cling of mud, would possess everything Arthur's grandfather had bled to build from nothing. The thought was a violation, a blade twisting in a wound deeper than any debt. Harris, with his predatory smile that never reached his eyes and his cologne that smelled of sterilized money, walking these fields, his shadow falling on the soil that held Arthur's very soul. It was in desecration that made his stomach clench with a rage so profound it was almost silent. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. For Arthur, the truth was simple and brutal. He was at the end of the line. The bank owned his land. The drought owned his sky. And despair, a patient and insidious creditor, owned his soul. So he did the only thing a man with nothing left to lose could do. He took his father's old shovel from the hooks in the mudroom, the hickory handle worn smooth and dark, shaped by the grip of a better man. He walked past the withered stalks in the fields, past the skeletal branches of the apple orchard, to the one place on his 300 acres that had always whispered of an older magic, of a deeper promise. The old, dry well at the base of Whisperwind Ridge. It was a relic, a stone-lined throat gaping at the pitiless sky. His father, a man who traded in hope as much as he did in grain, had told him stories of it. A hidden river, the old-timers called it, an aquifer so deep the droughts of men couldn't touch it. It was a fool's hope, a myth to cling to when the clouds betrayed you for a season or a year. But this was no season. This was an epic of failure. And a fool's hope was the only currency Arthur had left. He wasn't just digging for water. He was digging for a miracle, and he was prepared to tear open the belly of the earth to find it. The first shovelful was an act of defiance. The cracked, pale dirt resisted, clinging to its misery. He drove the spade in with the full weight of his body, the jarring impact traveling up his arms and into his teeth. The sun was a merciless hammer, each blow landing on the back of his neck, driving him deeper into his own grave. This wasn't digging. It was a punishment, a penance for the crime of failure. He worked until the blisters on his palms tore open, the sting of his own sweat in the raw flesh, a minor distraction from the aching fire in his back and shoulders. Hours bled into a single, aching continuum of muscle burn and lungfuls of dust. The hole grew deeper, a stubborn wound in the parched earth. By midday, he was lightheaded, moving in a haze of dehydration and despair. The well was a lie. His father's stories were just that, stories whispered to a boy to keep the dark at bay. There was no hidden river, no last-minute salvation buried beneath the failure. There was only this, the final, pathetic act of a broken man, a miller who had lost the one thing a miller was never supposed to lose, the farm. He was about to throw the shovel down, to finally surrender to the silence of the vultures circling high overhead, when it happened. A sound that didn't belong in his symphony of defeat. Not the soft thud of dirt or the grating scrape of stone. It was a solid, metallic clang that vibrated up the wooden handle and straight into the bones of his arms. Clang asterisk. He froze, every muscle screaming. Sweat stung his eyes, blurring the edges of the world. Curiosity, a feeling he thought long dead and buried, flickered to life like a pilot light in a derelict house. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp bite of pebbles, and began to dig with his bare hands. The desperation was primal. His fingers, already raw and bleeding, clawed at the compacted dirt like a starving animal unearthing a kill. He uncovered the flat, rusted top of a metal box. It was an old military footlocker, its olive drab paint peeling to reveal the angry red of the rust beneath. It was heavy, sealed tight, a forgotten secret the earth had held for who knew how long. It took every last ounce of his dwindling strength to heave it from its earthen tomb, his grunt of exertion swallowed by the vast, silent fields. He dragged it to the surface, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and a wild, terrifying hope. He stumbled to the old barn, the cathedral of his family's labor, and found a crowbar. The screech of metal on metal as he pried at the rusted hasps was the ugliest, most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It echoed across the silent farm, the sound of a lock being broken, of a fate being changed. He expected old tools, maybe some forgotten family heirlooms from the war. He did not expect what lay inside. Neat, tight bundles of $100 bills. Stacks upon stacks, wrapped in simple paper bands, packed so tightly they formed a solid block of green and white. An impossible treasure. He lifted one bundle, the paper crisp and alien in his dirt-caked, bloody hands. Then another and another. He began to laugh, a raw, cracked sound that was more of a sob, the noise of a soul breaking and healing in the same instant. It was impossible. It was a dream. It was a miracle. He counted a single stack, his fingers clumsy, $10,000. He looked at the box, at the dozens upon dozens of stacks. It had to be millions. Scrambling back to the farmhouse like a man pursued, he slammed the door and threw the bolt, his body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable energy. He dumped the contents onto the worn kitchen table, the bundles tumbling out like a flood of emerald green, covering the foreclosure notice, burying the white ghost of his failure. He spread them out, his hands shaking so violently he could barely count. 4 million, 4.5, 5 million dollars. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was salvation in paper form. He could pay off Harris. He could buy new equipment. He could buy water, seed, life itself. He could save the farm. He could save everything his name stood for. The joy was so pure, so overwhelming, it felt like it might split him in two. He was staring at his own resurrection, a miracle delivered by the very land that had tried to starve him. He was rich. He was free, or so he thought. The elation was a drug, a potent, dizzying high that scorched away the years of anxiety. For a solid hour, Arthur was not a farmer on the brink of ruin. He was a king surveying his reclaimed kingdom. He paced the small farmhouse, the worn floorboards groaning under the weight of his newfound hope, a weight far greater than his own body. He ran a hand over the cool, crisp stacks of money, the texture a thrilling counterpoint to the grit under his fingernails. He touched the faded photograph of his parents on the mantelpiece. Their smiling faces a testament to a time when the land was generous, and the future felt as solid as the oak beams overhead. "I did it," he whispered to them, his voice thick with emotion. "I saved it. I saved us." The money was a warm, heavy presence on the table, a silent $5 million promise that the struggle was over. The years of scrimping, of patching old equipment, of praying for rain that never came, all of it was history. A new history was about to be written. He allowed himself the indulgence of a detailed fantasy. He saw himself walking into the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the Consolidated Agriculture Bank. He wouldn't be the Arthur Miller who came in shuffling, hat in hand, to beg for another extension. He would be a different man entirely. He would see Mr. Harris at his polished mahogany desk, that condescending smirk already forming on his lips. And Arthur would simply place a cashier's check on that desk, a check for the entire outstanding principal plus interest. He imagined the look on Harris's face. The smirk wiped clean, replaced by slack-jawed shock, then a flicker of unwilling respect, and finally the cold, hard fury of a predator whose sure-thing kill had just gotten up and walked away. The fantasy was so sweet, so vivid. He savored it like a starving man's first meal. It was the taste of justice. To distract himself from the sheer, overwhelming reality of it all, to ground himself before his mind simply floated away on a cloud of euphoria, he switched on the old television in the corner. The CRT screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a pale blue light. The local news anchor's grave voice filled the quiet room. He was only half listening, his mind still swimming in glorious concrete plans. A new state-of-the-art irrigation system. A John Deere S780 combine, not a 30-year-old rust bucket. He could even help out his neighbors, the Garzas and the Hemlocks, who were suffering just as badly. He could be more than just saved. He could be a savior, a bastion of hope in a valley of despair. The investigation continues into last month's brazen mid-state armored car heist, the anchor said, his somber tone cutting through Arthur's reverie. Arthur's attention snagged on the words. He turned to the screen. Authorities are still searching for the $5 million in non-sequential bills, which remains missing after the suspect's vehicle crashed and burned during a high-speed pursuit on Route 82. Investigators believe the perpetrators, wanted in connection with a string of violent robberies, perished in the resulting fire, but the money, presumed to have been in a fire-resistant container, was never recovered. A grainy aerial photo of a burned-out van, a black scar on a lonely stretch of highway, appeared on the screen. The highway was just 20 miles from his farm. A glacial dread seeped into his marrow, freezing him from the inside out. He stared at the television, his breath catching in his throat, his heart beginning to pound a sickening, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Law enforcement officials have released a partial list of the stolen bills' serial numbers and are warning the public that the currency is marked and traceable through the Federal Reserve's electronic notification system. Any attempt to deposit or spend large quantities of this money will immediately trigger federal alarms. The screen split, showing a close-up of a $100 bill. A list of serial numbers scrolled slowly up the right side of the screen. Arthur stumbled toward the table, his legs suddenly weak, as if the bones had turned to dust. He snatched a bundle, his fingers fumbling with the paper band, tearing it. He held a single bill up to the light, the face of Benjamin Franklin seeming to mock him. He compared the number on the bill to the numbers scrolling past on the screen. It was a match. His vision swam. He grabbed another. A match. Another. A match. They were all matches. The joy that had filled him just moments before didn't just evaporate. It was violently sucked out, leaving a vacuum of pure, suffocating terror. This wasn't a miracle, it was a curse. This wasn't a key to freedom, it was the door to a federal prison cell. He couldn't spend it. He couldn't deposit it. He couldn't use it to write a cashier's check to wipe the smirk off Harris's face. He couldn't use it to save the farm. Every single bill was a silent witness to a violent crime, a tiny paper bomb waiting to detonate his life. The $5 million on his table wasn't salvation. It was a trap, meticulously laid by fate, and he had walked right into it with open arms. The farmhouse, which had briefly felt like a castle, now felt like a cage, and the treasure on his table was nothing more than 5 million pieces of evidence against him. The weight of the secret was a physical thing, a crushing pressure on Arthur's chest that made every breath a conscious effort. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of suspended panic, a prisoner in his own home. The silence of the farm was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. He jumped at the sound of every car that passed on the distant road, his mind instantly conjuring the image of a sheriff's cruiser kicking up a plume of dust as it turned down his lane. He imagined sirens in the whisper of the wind through the eaves. The money, which he'd hastily stuffed back into its metal coffin and reburied beneath the loose floorboards of the barn, was a malevolent presence. It didn't feel like an inanimate object. It felt alive, a pulsing node of dark energy buried under his feet, a constant, radioactive reminder of the impossible choice he faced. Turning it in was unthinkable. It would mean answering questions he couldn't possibly answer without implicating himself. Where did you find it? Oh, just digging in a well on my property. The same property where a burned-out getaway van was found just 20 miles away. He would become the prime suspect. They would tear his life apart, looking for connections to the dead robbers. His family's name, the one thing he had left, would be dragged through the mud. Keeping it meant possessing a fortune he could never use, all while his world crumbled around him on a non-negotiable schedule. The foreclosure was still coming. The drought wasn't going anywhere. He was a man dying of thirst while drowning in a sea of undrinkable water. On the third day, with the foreclosure deadline looming like a guillotine just 4 days away, the second blow fell. It was a quieter, more insidious attack. It came in the form of a notice tacked to the community bulletin board outside the town's general store. Arthur had driven in for supplies, his face a gray mask of sleeplessness, when he saw it. The paper was the same crisp, official stock as his foreclosure notice, the typeface cold and impersonal. It announced an emergency town hall meeting regarding the county's water rights. A knot of pure, cold dread tightened in his stomach. This was Harris. It had to be. That evening, he went to the meeting. The community hall was stuffy, paneled in dark wood that seemed to soak up the despair of the people packed inside. The room was filled with his neighbors, farmers with faces as cracked and worried as his own land. They were good people, hardworking people, who were being bled dry by the same relentless drought. The air was thick with anxiety and the smell of stale coffee. Then, Sterling Harris walked in. He moved through the crowd with the serene confidence of a shark gliding through a school of stunned fish. His suit was immaculate charcoal gray, his posture radiating an unassailable confidence that was a profound insult to the collective despair in the room. He took the podium, a thin, satisfied smile playing on his lips as he surveyed the worn-out faces before him. "As you all know," he began, his voice smooth as polished granite, devoid of any real sympathy, "the current water crisis has reached a critical point. The Havenwood Aquifer is at its lowest level in recorded history." He paused, a master of dramatic timing, letting the weight of his words settle like a shroud over the room. In light of this, and to ensure the most efficient and profitable allocation of this scarce resource. The Consolidated Agriculture Bank has petitioned the state for an emergency auction. We will be bidding to acquire the exclusive water rights for the entire basin. A wave of murmurs, then angry protests, rippled through the crowd. Old Man Hemlock, whose family had farmed the adjacent plot to the Millers for 90 years, struggled to his feet, his face pale with fury. "You can't do that, Harris. That water belongs to this town, to the people who have worked this land for 100 years. Harris's smile didn't waver. It was reptilian. "Actually, Mr. Hemlock, according to State Statute 43B, undeveloped subterranean resource rights revert to public auction during a declared state of emergency. A declaration which, I might add, the governor signed this morning at our bank's urging." The truth of it landed like a physical blow. The foreclosure, the pressure, the timing of it all, it wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a strategy, a conspiracy. Harris wasn't just foreclosing on Arthur's farm and a dozen others. That was just the first piece of the puzzle, the opening move in a ruthless game of chess. He was staging a corporate coup. He would use the farmers' debt to weaken them, then use the state of emergency he helped create to seize control of the one resource they all needed to survive. He was going to buy the town's water for pennies on the dollar and then sell it back to them, or more likely, to the corporate mega farms he'd invite in, at a massive, suffocating markup. He wasn't just taking their land. He was taking the very lifeblood that sustained it. He was condemning the entire valley to servitude or extinction. "The auction will be held in 4 days, Harris concluded, his eyes sweeping the room, seeming to linger on Arthur for a fraction of a second, a glint of final, triumphant victory in his gaze. "I trust you'll all understand. It's just business." As the crowd erupted in a mix of angry shouts and hopeless sighs, Arthur slipped out the back. He stood under the vast, empty sky, the banker's words echoing in his head. "It's just business asterisk." The game was rigged. The system wasn't broken. It was designed for men like Harris to win and men like him to lose. He was trapped, the town was trapped, and the $5 million of dirty money buried in his barn was nothing but a cruel, cosmic joke. He had a weapon he couldn't fire, a shield he couldn't lift. The despair was absolute, a black hole that consumed all light and all hope. That night, sleep was an impossibility, a luxury for men with futures. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, the foreclosure notice and the water auction flyer side by side under the dim glow of a single bulb. They were twin death sentences, one for his farm, one for his entire community. He felt a rage building inside him, a cold, hard fury that burned away the edges of his despair. Harris wasn't just a banker. He was a vulture, a creature that thrived on decay. He was circling a dying town, waiting patiently to pick its bones clean. And the system, the world of laws and finance, didn't just allow it. It encouraged it, rewarding the predator and punishing the prey. For hours, he stared into the darkness, his mind a maze with no exit. He was trapped between a prison cell and utter ruin. He couldn't use the money, and without it, he and everyone he knew were powerless. The thought was a relentless, grinding loop in his mind. Useless, powerless, useless, powerless. Then in the deepest, quietest hour before dawn, when the world is at its most silent and the human soul is at its most vulnerable, a different thought pushed its way through the fog of his despair. It was a strange, sideways thought born not of hope, but of pure, cornered animal desperation. What if you don't have to spend it? What if you didn't need to deposit it or exchange it? What if the goal wasn't to turn the dirty money into clean money, but to turn it into something else entirely? What if he could transform it? The idea was formless, a ghost of a notion, but it was the first new thought he'd had in days. He fired up his ancient, wheezing desktop computer, the dial-up connection screaming in protest as it clawed its way onto the World Wide Web. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just typed frantic, desperate queries into the search bar. Large cash purchases, untraceable assets, private sales, no questions asked, how to disappear money. The results were a predictable, sordid mix of illicit goods, financial scams, and articles about money laundering that sent a fresh wave of terror through him. It was hopeless. He was a farmer, not a criminal mastermind. He was about to give up, to let the black hole of despair consume him completely, when his eyes caught a small, text-based ad on the sidebar of a website for used farm equipment. It was an unobtrusive, pathetic-looking thing. Liquidation auction. Bankruptcy of AGRI Dynamics, Inc. All assets must go. He clicked on it, more out of idle curiosity than any real hope. The page was a sad digital graveyard of a failed tech company. Scraps of machinery, office furniture, lab equipment. He scrolled down, past industrial shelving and broken centrifuges, his finger heavy on the mouse wheel. And then he saw it. A single grainy photo of a massive, impossibly complex-looking machine. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, a behemoth of stainless steel, copper coils, and intricate tubing that seemed to defy easy explanation. The description read, Prototype Atmospheric Moisture Extractor VX7, experimental, untested, sold SIS. He read the words, a flicker of something lighting in his mind. And then he saw the line that made his heart stop, then restart with a single, powerful thud. Final sale price, $5 million. It was the exact amount, not close, not in the ballpark, exact. A coincidence so perfect, so statistically improbable, that it felt like a sign from the universe, a whispered instruction from the very fabric of fate. His pulse quickened, a frantic, hammering rhythm in his ears. He read the auction details. The sale was being handled by a third-party liquidator out of Cleveland. The terms were stark, written in cold, legal language. Payment must be made in full, in cash or certified funds at time of purchase. Due to the nature of the bankruptcy, this is a no-questions-asked sale for all prototype and experimental equipment. No questions asked. Cash. $5 million. It was alchemy. A way to transmute his dirty, cursed paper into a single, clean, physical asset. He wouldn't be depositing the money. He would be exchanging it. He would be trading a pile of evidence for a piece of machinery. The name Arthur Miller would appear on a bill of sale, a clean legal document. It was a long shot, a crazy, desperate, probably foolish gamble. The machine was experimental, untested. It might not even work. It could be the most expensive piece of scrap metal in human history. But it was a chance. It was the only chance he had. He would be walking into that auction with 3 duffel bags full of stolen money to buy a broken dream from a dead company. But if it worked, if he could make that machine pull water from the very air that the drought had rendered so empty, he wouldn't just be saving his farm. He would be creating an entirely new system, one where he didn't need the bank, the aquifer, or the permission of men like Sterling Harris. He would be making his own rain. The idea was so audacious, so utterly insane, that for the first time in days, Arthur Miller smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the grim, determined smile of a man who had found a weapon just as the enemy was breaking down his door. The journey was a pilgrimage of paranoia. 3 states, 2 days, and $5 million in stolen cash, packed into 3 heavy canvas duffel bags in the bed of his rusting Ford pickup. He'd hidden them under a greasy tarp, weighted down with old tire chains, but he felt as though the money was glowing, a beacon of criminality visible from space. Every state trooper car he saw on the highway sent a jolt of pure, sickening adrenaline through his system. His hands would slick with sweat on the steering wheel. His eyes locked on the rearview mirror, waiting for the flash of red and blue lights that would signal the end of his life as he knew it. Every toll booth felt like a checkpoint. Every disinterested attendant a federal agent scrutinizing his face. He drove mostly at night, a ghost haunting the interstate system, fueled by bitter, lukewarm coffee from gas station thermoses and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that there was no turning back. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a farmer fighting a foreclosure. He was an active participant in a felony, a man laundering stolen money in the most audacious way imaginable, betting his entire future on a piece of junk science from a bankrupt company hundreds of miles from home. He slept for a few hours in a grimy motel outside Toledo, the duffel bags piled in the room with him, the door wedged shut with a chair. He lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the roar of trucks on the nearby highway, each one sounding like a battering ram coming for him. The auction was held in a cavernous, dusty warehouse on the industrial outskirts of Cleveland. The air inside smelled of rust, ozone, and the quiet desperation of failure. The other attendees were a flock of vultures, scrap dealers with cold eyes and part scavengers with greedy hands, all of them picking over the metallic corpse of Agridynamics, Inc. They eyed Arthur, a clear outsider in his worn jeans and work boots, and his 3 heavy bags with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He ignored them, his focus lasered in on the object of his quest, a gravitational center in a universe of scrap. The atmospheric moisture extractor VX7 was even more imposing in person. It was a tangled, beautiful mess of technology, the size of a small tractor, all gleaming stainless steel and complex copper wiring that hinted at a brilliant, unrealized dream. It looked both futuristic and obsolete at the same time, a monument to a future that never arrived. He found the auctioneer, a wiry man with a clipboard and weary eyes that had seen 1,000 bankruptcies. "I'm here for the VX7, Arthur said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man grunted, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Lot 47, you the only one who inquired. 5 million as listed." "You got funds," Arthur nodded, his throat suddenly as dry as his fields. "Cash." The auctioneer finally looked at him, really looked at him, a flicker of something, surprise, amusement, professional indifference, in his eyes. All of it. "Son, you know this thing's a prototype, right? A tax write-off, probably doesn't even run. There's no manual, no warranty, no nothing. We're selling it as scrap, basically, by the pound." "I know," Arthur said, his voice firm. "I'll take it." The transaction felt surreal, like something out of a crime movie he'd once seen. In a grimy, cinder-block back office, under the flickering glare of a fluorescent light, Arthur heaved the duffel bags onto a metal desk that rattled under their weight. The auctioneer and a stone-faced security guard spent the next 20 minutes feeding the bundles of $100 bills through a counting machine. The rhythmic whirring was the only sound in the room, a mechanical heartbeat counting down Arthur's old life and counting up his new one. Each whir was a moment of terror. He was certain an alarm would sound, that the machine was cross-referencing serial numbers, but it just counted. They didn't check the numbers. They didn't ask where the money came from. The bankruptcy court just wanted the debt settled. As promised, it was a no-questions-asked affair. When the count was confirmed at exactly $5 million, the auctioneer slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. A bill of sale. Arthur signed it, his hand surprisingly steady. The name Arthur Miller was now legally, irrevocably tied to this hulking piece of metal. He had done it. He had laundered the curse. He had traded the 5 million pieces of evidence for a single, legitimate asset. The relief was so profound it almost buckled his knees. He walked out of that office feeling lighter than he had in years, the crushing psychic weight of the illicit cash finally gone. In its place was a new, heavier burden, a $5 million multi-ton gamble that was now his to transport, assemble, and somehow, miraculously, make work. As he stood in the dusty lot arranging for a flatbed truck to haul his monstrous purchase back to Havenwood, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had gotten rid of the evidence. He had completed the alchemy. Now, all he had to do was perform a miracle. The arrival of the VX-7 was an event in Havenwood. The massive flatbed truck, groaning under the weight of its futuristic cargo, rumbled down the town's main street and turned every head. People came out of the general store and the diner, shielding their eyes from the sun, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. When it pulled into Arthur's dusty driveway, his neighbors, the Garzas and the Hemlocks, emerged from their homes to watch the spectacle. They saw the crane carefully lower the metallic behemoth onto a concrete slab Arthur had poured near the dry well. It sat there like a crashed spaceship, an alien monument to his perceived insanity. "What in God's name is that thing, Art?" asked his neighbor Miguel Garza, a good man whose own cornfields were withering on the stalk. He was a friend and his voice was gentle, laced with genuine concern. "It's a new kind of irrigation system," Arthur replied, the lie tasting thin and inadequate on his tongue. How could he explain what it really was? The physical manifestation of a dead criminal's score. Garza just shook his head slowly, the look in his eyes saying what everyone in Havenwood was thinking. The drought finally broke him. Poor Art's gone and lost his mind. The whispers started that very day and spread through the valley like a brush fire. Arthur Miller, who was about to lose the family farm, had spent his last dime on a pile of scrap metal. He was a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting his own life. The struggle began the next morning. It was a battle fought not against a banker, but against physics, engineering, and his own profound ignorance. The machine had no instructions, no user manual, not even a simple on switch. It was a complex three-dimensional puzzle with potentially lethal consequences if assembled incorrectly. The first week was a blur of grinding frustration. He spent his days tracing color-coded wires that led to nowhere, trying to decipher cryptic labels on junction boxes written in an engineer's shorthand, and poring over obscure academic papers and patent filings he'd found online for agridynamics. He slowly, painfully began to understand. He learned the machine's theoretical principle was sound, even elegant. Using a series of supercooled condenser coils, an electrostatic charge, and beds of hygroscopic salts to pull ambient humidity out of the air, even in an arid environment, and coalesce it into liquid water. The theory was genius. The reality was a nightmare of mismatched parts, proprietary connectors he couldn't find replacements for, and a central operating system that was protected by a layer of encryption he would never be able to break. He slept in the barn on a cot, often for only a few hours at a time, waking with the ghost of a solution in his mind, only to see it evaporate in the harsh light of day. He grew thin, his face a mask of grease and exhaustion, his eyes sunk deep in their sockets. The town's whispers grew louder, more certain. He saw the pity in their eyes when he went to the store. He was Crazy Art, the man who was building a monument to his own failure. He'd stare at the inert machine, his $5 million tombstone on his failed farm, and the sheer, crushing weight of his gamble would threaten to suffocate him. Had he traded a prison sentence for a different kind of life-ending failure? Was this all for nothing? One night, after a full day spent trying to bypass the encrypted software with no success, rigging up a direct power line that only resulted in a shower of sparks and the acrid smell of burning wires, he finally broke. He kicked the machine's unyielding steel chassis, a scream of pure, helpless rage tearing from his throat, a sound of animal despair that echoed across the dead fields. He sank to the ground, his head in his hands, the silence of the failed farm pressing in on him. He was done. It was over. Harris had won. As he sat there, utterly defeated, his eyes fell upon the manufacturer's plate riveted to the side of the machine. It was a simple aluminum rectangle, listing serial numbers and power requirements. At the bottom, it listed the names of the lead engineers. One name stood out, one he recognized from a patent filing he'd read a dozen times: Dr. Aris Thorne, lead propulsion and atmospheric sciences. On a wild, desperate whim, the last twitch of a dying hope, he stumbled back inside to his wheezing computer. He looked up the name, and after an hour of searching through archived university websites, he found an old faculty page with an email address. His hands shaking with a new, fragile hope, he wrote a simple, honest email. He poured his desperation, his respect for the machine's design, and his simple farmer's plea into the message. "Dr. Thorne," it began, "my name is Arthur Miller. I'm a farmer in a place where it no longer rains. I think I have your machine, the VX7, and I need your help." He hit send, and the message disappeared into the digital ether, a prayer launched into the void. 3 agonizing days passed with no reply. Each hour felt like a week. Arthur's fragile hope began to wither and die, just like his crops. He spent his time making grim preparations, sorting through generations of family belongings, deciding what little he could take with him when the sheriff came to evict him. The auction for the water rights was just 1 day away. He had failed. He was staring out at his brown, dead fields, the metallic hulk of the VX7 mocking him under the afternoon sun, when his computer chimed with the tinny, electronic sound of an incoming email. His heart leaped into his throat. It was from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was one word: VX7. It was from Dr. Thorne. The message was short, blunt, and cautious. "Which machine? How did you get it?" Arthur wrote back immediately, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He explained about the bankruptcy auction, about the liquidator in Cleveland. He left out the part about the $5 million in duffel bags. He simply said he'd bought it, that he believed in it, and that he thought he could make it work if he could just get past the encryption. A chain of emails began, a frantic, high-stakes back and forth between a desperate farmer on the edge of oblivion and a disgraced, brilliant engineer whose life's work had been sold for scrap. Dr. Thorne, it turned out, was now a community college professor in Oregon. He was bitter, angry that the board of agri-dynamics had pulled the plug on his project just as he was on the verge of a breakthrough. At first, he was reluctant to help, but something in Arthur's plea, the simple, raw desire to make something grow, to fight back against a dying world, resonated with the broken idealist in him. Finally, after Arthur sent him a dozen high-resolution photos of the machine's current state, Thorne relented. He sent a file. It was a diagnostic override, a string of code that was a backdoor into the VX7's operating system, along with a crudely drawn wiring diagram scrawled on a digital notepad. "This will bypass the main encryption and allow you to run the core systems manually," Thorne wrote. "But the power sequencing has to be exact. I mean *exact*. Get it wrong and you'll create a feedback loop that will fry the entire core. It'll be scrap metal in less than a second. You only get one shot, farmer. Don't screw it up." That night, under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver of moon, Arthur went to work. He followed Thorne's diagram with the laser focus of a bomb disposal expert, his hands, for the first time in weeks, completely steady. He rerouted power conduits, bypassed fried circuits with heavy-gauge copper wire, and connected the machine's main reactor to a secondary power source. his farm's old, massive diesel generator. As the sun began to rise, a pale pink line on the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley, he was ready. This was it, the final gamble, the last play. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the dry air burning his lungs, and flipped the main breaker on the generator. It roared to life, its familiar, rhythmic chug a comforting sound in the tense silence. He then turned to the makeshift control panel he jury-rigged, his heart pounding, and engaged the override sequence Thorne had sent him. For a moment, nothing happened. The generator chugged, the machine sat silent. A sickening, hollow dread washed over him. He had failed. He had fried it. Then a low hum started from deep within the VX-7. It grew louder, a resonant thrum that vibrated through the concrete slab and into the soles of his boots. A series of lights, dusty and dim, flickered on across the machine's chassis, one by one, bathing the pre-dawn darkness in an ethereal blue glow. The giant fans on its side began to spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster, creating a powerful vortex, pulling in the dry morning air. A thick, delicate layer of white ice began to form on a section of copper coils, a stark, impossible frost in the middle of the parched landscape. And then he saw it. A single, perfect drop of water formed on a collection nozzle. It hung there for a second, shimmering like a diamond in the machine's eerie light, before falling into the collection basin with a soft asterisk plink asterisk. The sound was louder than a gunshot. It was followed by another, and another. A trickle became a steady stream. Clean, clear, life-giving water conjured from thin air. Arthur sank to his knees, the exhaustion of the past weeks, the fear, the despair, all washing away in that miraculous flow. He laughed, a real, full-throated laugh of pure, unadulterated triumph that echoed across the valley. He had done it. He hadn't just bought a machine, he had harnessed a miracle. The sun rose higher, illuminating an impossible sight. In a county of brown, dying land, Arthur Miller's farm was the only place on earth where it had begun to rain. The transformation of the Miller farm was slow, then sudden, like a fever breaking. For the first few days, the change was subtle, visible only to an observant eye. The patches of cracked, pale earth nearest the machine turned from dust to a deep, dark mud. The townspeople who drove by on the county road saw the humming, glowing machine and the new mud puddles, and shook their heads, assuming Art had finally gone and cracked a water main he didn't have, wasting the last of the town's precious reserves. But Arthur, working with a manic, joyous energy he hadn't felt in years, laid down a network of irrigation pipes, channeling the VX-7's steady output across his most promising fields. The machine, which he now thought of as a living creature, produced thousands of gallons of water a day, a quiet, humming river created from nothing but air and ingenuity. He was a god, making his own weather. Within a week, the first green shoots appeared. They pushed through the damp soil, tentative at first, then growing with an unnatural vitality, fed not by sporadic, hoped-for rain, but by a constant, reliable source of pure, clean water. Within 2 weeks, Arthur's fields were an island of impossible, vibrant green in an ocean of brown. The corn stalks grew tall and strong, their leaves a deep, healthy emerald. It was a stark, visual miracle that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Word began to spread through the valley. People didn't understand what they were seeing. They drove by slowly, their trucks kicking up dust, their faces pressed against the glass. They whispered about illegal wells drilled deep into the aquifer, about some secret deal Arthur had made with a shady water company. No one could believe the truth, because the truth was too insane. But the result was undeniable. While their own crops withered and died on the stalk, Arthur Miller's farm was thriving. It was a defiant, living rebuke to the drought, and to the despair that had gripped Havenwood. The first harvest was a spectacle. He had planted a fast-growing, high-yield variety of sweet corn, a gamble made months ago in a different lifetime that now paid off spectacularly. The ears were heavy, the kernels plump and bursting with sweetness. He didn't have to look for buyers. They came to him. Wholesalers and restaurant suppliers from 3 counties over, hearing rumors of a miracle harvest in the middle of the worst drought in a century, showed up at his farm with cash in hand. They walked through his green fields, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. They didn't care how he'd done it, they just wanted his product. The bidding was fierce, a small, localized frenzy for his impossible corn. He sold his entire crop at a premium 5 times the normal market rate. The first check he received was for an amount so large it made his head spin, a number with more zeros than he was used to seeing. The next morning, he drove not to Harris's bank in Havenwood, but to the credit union in the next county over. He walked up to the teller, a young woman with kind eyes, and opened a business account under the name Miller Regenerative Agriculture. He endorsed the check and pushed it under the glass. As he watched her deposit the funds, the numbers appearing on the small screen in front of him, a profound sense of peace settled over him. This was clean money. He hadn't found it in a box buried in the dirt. He had earned it. He had created it from desperation, ingenuity, and sheer force of will. In a strange, beautiful alchemy, he had taken $5 million in dirty cash and turned it into a machine that generated life. And that machine, in turn, was now generating a new, legitimate fortune. Over the next few weeks, the cycle repeated. He planted again, a fast-growing soybean varietal. He harvested again. The money in his new account grew at an astonishing rate. He paid off his suppliers. He bought a new, used tractor. He was no longer a broken man on the verge of foreclosure. He was the most successful, most enigmatic farmer in the state. He had become a master of his own system, a rainmaker in a dry land, a man who had stared into the abyss and forced it to yield a harvest. And all the while, he watched the calendar, his gaze fixed on a single, circled date, the day of the Havenwood water rights auction, the day he would finally face Sterling Harris. The day of the auction dawned hot and still, the air thick with dust and resignation. The community hall was even more crowded than before, but the angry, defiant energy of the last meeting had been replaced by a funereal quiet. It felt less like a public auction and more like a public execution. The townspeople were there to witness the official death of their way of life, to see the final nail being hammered into the coffin of their community. Sterling Harris stood at the front of the room, a portrait of corporate triumph. He chatted amiably with a state official who had driven in to oversee the proceedings. His sharp suit was a stark contrast to the worn denim and faded plaid of the farmers. He exuded an air of complete, unassailable control, the calm confidence of a man playing a game he had already won. He was not there to bid, he was there to collect. Just as the proceedings were about to begin, the doors at the back of the hall creaked open. A murmur went through the crowd. Arthur Miller walked in. He looked like a different man. The haunted, desperate look that had lived in his eyes for years was gone, replaced by a calm, quiet intensity. He wasn't covered in grease or dirt. He wore a simple, clean work shirt and jeans, but he carried himself with an unfamiliar weight, an aura of substance that made people look twice. He was no longer crazy art. He was the man with the green fields. He took a seat in the back row, nodding to a few of his neighbors. They stared at him with a mixture of awe, confusion, and a desperate, illogical flicker of hope. Harris glanced back, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw Arthur. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, the irritation of a fly daring to land on his perfectly prepared meal. He gave Arthur a dismissive smirk, a silent acknowledgement of the farmer who had somehow managed to get one good harvest in before the end. Then he turned back to the official, dismissing Arthur from his mind. The auction began. The auctioneer, a man brought in from the state capital, read the legal descriptions of the water rights in a droning, bureaucratic monotone. It was a formality. Everyone in the room knew there would only be one bidder. We will open the bidding for the exclusive rights to the Havenwood Basin at the state-mandated minimum of $2 million, the auctioneer announced. Do I have an opening bid? Harris raised a single, manicured finger without even turning around. $2 million, he said, his voice laced with the boredom of inevitable victory. The auctioneer scanned the silent room. I have $2 million. Do I hear 2.5? Silence. The air was thick with despair, the sound of a community holding its breath. Going once, 2.5 million, a clear, strong voice called from the back of the room. Every head in the hall whipped around. It was Arthur. A collective gasp rippled through the hall, a sudden shock of electricity in the dead air. Sterling Harris turned slowly, his smug expression replaced by one of genuine, profound shock. He stared at Arthur, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if a ghost had just spoken. For a moment, he seemed to think it was a joke, a pathetic final act of defiance. Then he saw the look on Arthur's face, calm, resolute, deadly serious. Harris's face hardened, the shock replaced by cold fury. His eyes turned to slits. 3 million, he snapped, his voice sharp and contemptuous. 3.5, Arthur replied instantly, his voice even and strong without a trace of hesitation. The duel had begun. The room was no longer silent, it was electric. The townspeople were on the edge of their seats, their faces a canvas of disbelief and dawning hope, watching a battle they never thought would be fought. The numbers climbed, a rapid-fire volley between the predatory banker at the front and the quiet farmer at the back. 4 million, 5, 6. With each bid from Arthur, Harris grew more agitated, his carefully constructed composure cracking. This wasn't part of his meticulously crafted plan. The water was supposed to be his for a pittance. This farmer, this nobody, was costing him millions. 7 million, Harris spat, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of his chair. He glared at Arthur, trying to intimidate him, to remind him of his place. The auctioneer looked at Arthur. The room held its breath. This was a fortune. No independent farmer had this kind of money. Arthur met Harris's furious gaze from across the room. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, savoring the moment, the look of rising panic on Harris's face. Then he spoke, his voice calm and clear, ringing through the hall. $10 million. The number hung in the air, stunning the room into absolute, echoing silence. 10 million. It was an impossible sum, a mythical figure. Harris stared, his mouth slightly agape. The color had drained from his face. He did a quick, frantic calculation in his head, his corporate mind assessing profit margins, leverage, and acquisition costs. At that price, his meticulously planned coup was no longer profitable. It was a bad investment. And Sterling Harris was a businessman, not a gambler. He looked at Arthur, at the unwavering, stony certainty in his eyes, and he knew, with a sickening lurch in his gut, that he was beaten. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook his head. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the silent hall. $10 million, going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Arthur Miller. The room exploded. A wave of cheers, applause, and tearful, joyous shouts washed over Arthur. He had done the impossible. He had faced down the giant and won. He walked to the front of the room, his calloused hands signing the paperwork that gave him ownership of the town's lifeblood. He passed a seething, defeated Sterling Harris, who refused to meet his eye. Then he turned to face his neighbors, his friends, his community. "I have just one announcement to make," Arthur said, his voice ringing with an emotion that caught in his throat. "These water rights don't belong to me. They belong to Havenwood. As of this moment, I am donating them back to the town to be managed by a community trust for the benefit of all of us forever." It was a moment that would be etched into the town's history, the day a quiet farmer, armed with a secret and an impossible machine, bought their future back from the brink and gave it to them for free. Arthur never told anyone about the $5 million he found buried in the dirt. That secret was his alone, a moral weight he would carry forever. The story the town knew was simpler, and in its own way more powerful. They saw him as a genius, an innovator who had unlocked a secret to surviving, even thriving, when the old ways had failed completely. He became a quiet legend. The VX7, which they now called Arthur's Well, hummed day and night at the edge of his fields, a constant, gentle promise of life and independence. He helped his neighbors, using his clean profits and the knowledge gleaned from Dr. Thorne to fund a local agri-tech cooperative, building smaller, more efficient versions of the machine. Havenwood became an oasis, a beacon of impossible green in a thirsty state, a testament to resilience, innovation, and community. But the story wasn't truly over. There was one final debt to be paid, not a financial debt, but a moral one. A few months after the auction, the inevitable happened. The Consolidated Agriculture Bank of Havenwood was sold. Its major investor, stung by the massive, public failure of the water rights gamble, had pulled out, causing a collapse. The new owners were a regional credit union, the same one where Arthur had opened his first real account. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur walked into the bank. It looked the same cold marble floors, the same sterile air, but the soul of the place had changed. He was there to close the loop. He asked to see the branch manager. A young, nervous man came out, but Arthur shook his head. "No," he said calmly, "I need to see Mr. Harris." The manager explained with some discomfort that Mr. Harris was no longer with the bank, not in any official capacity. He had been reassigned after the auction fiasco. In a move of perfect corporate cruelty, he wasn't fired but demoted, tasked with handling delinquent accounts from a small office in the back. It was a position designed for maximum humiliation. Arthur found him there, in a cramped, windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and defeat. The mahogany desk was gone, replaced by cheap particle board. Harris looked up, and the color drained from his face when he saw Arthur standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled, off-the-rack shirt. The predatory confidence had vanished, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out man. "Miller," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "What do you want?" Arthur didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at the man who had tried to ruin him, who had tried to bleed his town dry. He felt no hatred, no anger, only a quiet, profound sense of finality, of a circle being completed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the creases. It was the original foreclosure notice for his farm. He unfolded it and placed it gently on Harris's cluttered desk, on top of a stack of files for other desperate farmers. "I just came to tell you that the debt is paid," Arthur said, his voice soft but firm. Harris stared at the paper, then back at Arthur, his expression a mixture of confusion, shame, and utter incomprehension. I don't understand," Arthur smiled, a real, genuine smile, the first truly peaceful smile of his adult life. "I know you don't." He turned and walked away, leaving Harris alone in his little box of a room with the ghost of a battle he had so thoroughly, completely lost. As Arthur stepped back out into the bright sunshine of Havenwood, a town reborn, he knew his own story was complete. He had faced ruin and found a cursed treasure. He had wrestled with a moral dilemma and chosen a dangerous, uncertain path. He had laundered dirty money into clean water, transforming a criminal's greed into a community's salvation. He had learned that sometimes, to fix a broken system, you have to break the rules and build something new in its place. The ends, he thought, looking out at the green fields stretching to the horizon, had more than justified the means. And so, his destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. His story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. Arthur Miller proved that one man's desperation, guided by a moral compass and a radical idea, can rewrite the fate of an entire community. The ends, it seems, justified the means. But as one man breaks the system, another is trapped by it. What happens when the hero of one story is the villain of the next? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.